This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation. The Nigel Farage Show.
Well, really shocking pictures from Salisbury in the last 48 hours. Not just the town centre, the market square, but also the little cul-de-sac in which the former Russian spy lived. And to see people wearing NBC kit, nuclear, biological, chemical kit, really is very, very shocking indeed. And this morning's breaking news that up to 500 Salisbury pub goers and diners have been told to wash possessions as a precaution after nerve agent traces were found. And there are 5 possible locations across Salisbury that have been identified as the possible source of this nerve agent. So no one quite knows where all this is going. Sleepy little city, not much bigger than a market town, frankly, in southern Wiltshire, and it is a huge, huge shock to everybody. And I suppose in some ways this does come back to leadership. You know, I've always been one that said we should try to talk to the Russians. We should try to improve our relationship, if that is possible. And we have to be fair and say that at the moment we don't have any proof as to what the source of this was, whether it was a Russian state actor. But, you know, there's a very long list of people who are seen as either being traitors to Russia or people who've crossed Vladimir Putin, who are no longer around. Boris Berezovsky, found apparently hanged in his bathroom in 2013. A series of British businessmen. Scott Young, Paul Castle, Robbie Curtis. There's a long, long list here. And, of course, the Litvinenko poisoning, which we saw played out so publicly on our screens 10 years ago, which we had pretty conclusive proof was linked to Russian state actors. So we can't ignore this. It's happening in our backyard. And there are 500 people this morning in Salisbury going to be actually rather worried about what their situation is. So it does come back to leadership. Now, it's very interesting that at the time when some of us were talking about perhaps trying to talk to Russia, Theresa May was taking very much the opposite view. You know, she said when she became Prime Minister that she would sup with a long spoon with the Russians and that it would not be business as usual with Moscow. She promised to distance her party from the Russian donors. And yet, the front page today of the Sunday Times, you know, big article there saying that declared donations worth over £825,000 have come from Russian link supporters since she became Prime Minister in July 2016. So what with that and the ongoing investigation, is it time that Mrs. May perhaps picked up an idea from Donald Trump? And I've talked before about her lack of decisive leadership, but I was very struck by Peter Oborne yesterday in the Mail. Headline, "It's time Mrs. May took a leaf out of Trump's book." And what he was really talking about here was leadership in terms of how we deal with the negotiations with Brussels. But actually, I'm going to take the Oborne theme on a little bit and say, I think now what she should do is to demand a meeting with Putin and to go and ask for some explanations. Is it perhaps now time, given the magnitude of what is happening in Salisbury, is it time she confronted him over this issue? Call me on 0345 6060 973. Maybe you think that's wrong. We should just keep as far away from Putin as we possibly can, in which case text to 84850. Or maybe you think that actually the most positive thing she could do is to hand back the Russian donor money. And if you think that, then tweet using the hashtag Farage and LBC at LBC, and you can watch us on Facebook. We're live from London next. Now, when I talked about this on Thursday, a lot of you ringing in felt this wasn't the Russians, that it was simply too obvious, and that perhaps the whole thing was designed to set them up. And I have to say, having thought about this, there's just too much evidence, isn't there? And don't forget that Skripal, this guy, when he was an agent, was handing information to the British. And that's why they put him in prison in Russia, and then he was part of a spy exchange swap for Anna Chapman. And, I've no doubt that the Russian leadership, and probably majority of Russian people, do not view traitors particularly kindly. So in terms of Putin's standing in his own country, if your average Russian voter thought that Putin had him bumped off, that might actually do his popularity more good than harm. But what we can't have, and I was going to say the streets of London, because that's where you expect this stuff if it's going to happen. We can't expect the streets of anywhere in our country. We can't stand idly by and allow this sort of thing to happen. The Russians could have killed the spy when they caught him. Looks to me it could be done by someone else, says Kevin from Warrington. Well, Kevin, they could have killed him when they caught him, but they didn't. He went through a judicial process. If this is the Russians doing it, it's them saying, isn't it? You can run, but you can't hide. In the end, we are going to catch up with you. I have another one here. I have my doubts that Russia is to blame. It's interesting. A lot of people are very, very doubtful that Russia is to blame. I don't know the answer to it, but it does seem to me to be very likely, given the events that we've seen before. Now, whether the real question is, was this somebody who was sanctioned by the Russian government to do what he or she did? And none of us know the answer to that. Nigel is calling from Winchmore Hill. Good morning.
Good morning, Nigel.
So
Good name.
Well, very absolutely. I'm sorry that you're stuck with it. I just think here's a moment. I mean, frankly, we've heard nothing from Mrs. May, have we, since the incidents in Salisbury? We did hear her saying she wouldn't take Russian money for the party, and they have. Isn't this a moment for her to show true leadership and to say to Putin, right, we've got to sit down and talk about this?
Well, absolutely. I mean, let's just face it, leading up to this, we've had the most immense amount of propaganda, anti-Russian propaganda. There has been no evidence at all produced against Putin precisely, even in the Litvinenko case. It was just probably. And the truth is that what we need is a new narrative in the world to talk about, the existence of Russia and it to be part of a global environment that's ruled under international law. And I think the Russians are arguing for that themselves.
OK, so you're another one, Nigel, that thinks that, maybe this is not as obvious as it looks at first glance.
Well, I have several concerns. The first being that the source of the nerve agent just happens to be manufactured 6 miles away in Porton Down. That seems like too much of a coincidence for my liking. And also, what I don't like is the reaction.
But Porton Down, Nigel, Porton Down doesn't commercially sell things on the market, does it?
No, I mean, obviously that it might have been leaked from there, or who knows. I just think that should form part of the investigation. I make no assumptions at this point. I just say that it's a very coincidental. But my concern is the reaction that we've had so far, which is to increase NATO's presence in Eastern Europe, which seems to me to lead to a motive why you would attack this man or kill this man, because Russia would be crazy to have done this themselves, right?
Everyone says Russia would have been crazy to do this themselves, and I completely understand that argument, but there's a long list of coincidences here, Nigel, aren't they, going back many, many years. Basically, if you've been a Russian spy that's given away state secrets and you're living in the West, your life's in danger, isn't it?
Well, and how many British spies have we terminated over the years for treasonous acts against this country?
Well, actually, the Cambridge spies went off and lived their lives untouched by us until they died.
Well, look, as I said, all you need is some evidence, right? If you provide some evidence, then, and that's my concern, is that at what point are people guilty until proven innocent? Provide slam dunk evidence, then we would not be speculating, we would not be having these conversations.
Well, either way, Nigel, whether my suspicions are right or whether your suspicions are right, the atmosphere of distrust between us and Russia is almost now back to Cold War levels.
Well, and I feel that is totally unacceptable. Remember, the Russians fought in both the First World War and the Second World War. They lost 20 million, so more than the Allies put together, right? And our reaction to them is disgraceful, the way that we've treated them in terms of that relationship.
So either way, Nigel, return to my original point, would this be a good moment for Theresa May to say, let's have a summit, let's have a meeting, let's talk about this?
Absolutely, it's a no-brainer.
It's a no-brainer. Gotcha. Nigel says it's a no-brainer. You're listening to the Sunday edition of a Nigel Farage show, exclusive at LBC. It's now 11:15. Sleepy City Salisbury suddenly is the centre, not just of attention in this country, but right across the world. People are seeing what is going on, and there's been a new twist and development this morning. I'm going to go to the Market Square in Salisbury now and talk to Adele Robinson, Sky News' correspondent, who's there. Good morning, Adele.
Good morning.
Good morning. So what's the new development?
Well, the Chief Medical Officer, Dame Sally Davies, has been speaking within the last hour, and she's effectively issued some advice that is basically that anyone who attended the Mill Pub or Zizi's restaurant here in Salisbury last Sunday should be washing their clothes. That's the sort of top line of it. She has reiterated that this should affect less than 500 people, that it's actually between the hours of 1:30 p.m. last Sunday and evening closing on Monday. Anyone who was in these two locations should be taking action. She stressed, though, that this is a precautionary measure, that the risk to public safety is low, that she's confident that customers and staff members, none have been harmed. She said that trace levels of a nerve agent have been discovered in Zizi's and the Mill Pub on surfaces, and obviously trace means low level. It's taken a while for these scientific tests to come back because they're scientific tests, and she has also emphasised that nobody's health has been harmed while they've had to wait, effectively.
No, and tell me, what's it like? I mean, I know it's Sunday morning and not a particularly busy day in Salisbury because I know the place quite well, but I mean, just sort of talking to residents, are people just bewildered by this?
Yeah, bewildered, fascinated, and a little alarmed, if I'm honest, because you'll have seen that on the television there have been scenes of people who are masked, suited, booted, wearing hazmat suits. We've got specialists from the Army, the RAF and the Royal Marines who have been on the streets of Salisbury offering their specialist expertise in chemical warfare, and they've been taking away, isolating objects and vehicles such as ambulances and flowers from a grave site for decontamination, and also because as part of the investigation they'll be trying to build up a footprint of where exactly this nerve agent or traces of it are to be found, and potentially through this footprint they will be able to trace back the origin.
Yes, so as to whether it came through their front door at home or was administered somehow in public.
Exactly, yeah, that's exactly what they will be trying to establish. A little bit more information as well from Dame Sally Davies, the Chief Medical Officer. She's asked, I mean, it's extraordinary, really. She's saying that people should be washing their clothing that they haven't already if they've been in Zizi's and the Mill Pub. Any items that can't be washed, so, for example, clothes that need to be dry cleaned, they should be double bagged in plastic until further information is available. She's also asking people to wipe personal items such as phones and handbags and other electronic items, even baby items, and dispose of them in plastic bags.
It's pretty alarming stuff, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. I mean, when you're told to, wash all of your jewellery and your glasses with warm water and detergent just because you went to the pub or you went to a restaurant, of course that's going to be alarming. People, I spoke to a hairdresser yesterday where Mr. Skripal used to get his hair cut on a regular basis. And she said that they were scared. But at the same time, these sort of things don't happen in, as it's locally known as Salisbury.
Salisbury, I know. And finally, Adele, do we have any update on the medical condition of the Skripals?
Only that they're still in a critical but stable condition, and that's continuing. And also, obviously, the Detective Sergeant Nick Bailey, he's in a serious but stable condition, and as you know, he has already issued a statement last night speaking from his hospital bed, saying that he was thanking the public effectively for their support, and also saying that he didn't see himself as a hero, and that he was just doing his job.
Just doing his job. I saw that. Yeah, very modest, and in absolutely the best traditions of all the emergency services in our country. Adele Robinson from Sky News from Salisbury, thank you very much indeed. Well, have to say, even though Dame Sally Davies may have tried to play down concerns over this, I think to be told that, wash clothes, wash your jewellery, bag up clothes, double bag clothes. I would have thought there's a lot of people in Salisbury this morning who are perhaps getting more concerned as time passes rather than less so. So, is it time for Theresa May to take a leaf out of Donald Trump's book? After all, he's going to go and meet the North Korean leader. Is it time she went and met Putin? And we had this out in public. Hassan from Slough is on the line. Good morning.
Hi, morning, Nigel. Hi, we spoke last year about Brexit, but very interesting topic, this one.
Right. So what do you think? What should the response of the government be, Hassan, to this? I mean, we haven't got conclusive proof yet, but they need to do something, don't they?
Yeah, no, they do, I agree. It's a difficult one, actually. I think it should be business as usual, but certainly Theresa May should protest.
Hassan, are you speaking clearly into the mouthpiece?
I am speaking very clearly, yes. Is there a crackling sound here?
I'll tell you what we'll do. I'm going to drop you and get you back in a moment. I'm going to go to Charles in Birmingham. Charles, good morning.
Good morning.
So we don't know that it's the Russians, but many of us suspect that it is. I suppose we could freeze a few bank accounts, we could kick out a few diplomats, we might even talk about not going to the World Cup, but that would enrage, I think, millions of football supporters. But isn't it time for leadership, Charles?
It is, but if we play the World Cup, every country's got to follow us, otherwise it will make no difference. That is the problem you have. Unless countries follow us and help us, if it's the Russians, if it's proven, it's going to make no difference to Russia whatsoever, at all. Because we play the World Cup, somebody else, okay, we can win it. But
yes.
Mind
you, Charles, the chances of England winning the World Cup are pretty limited, aren't they?
That's right. That's correct. But the other thing is as well, I mean, whoever administered this stuff to these people is either lying in the house dead or walking round, because they've got to be looking for a third person, surely, as well. I mean, how was this administered?
Well, I just haven't got a clue how that would operate. I mean, it is possible, Charles, I suppose, that this agent was inside a parcel or a package that was opened. Charles, I don't know, and from the sounds of it, no one at the moment knows exactly how this happened. And the other problem, Charles, is, I mean, firstly, it's tough to know exactly what to do, but I do think maybe, having a meeting, having this out in public might be a good thing, but it's also very tough to know whether we'll ever get proof, because even if it turned out that this was done by somebody who's a Russian agent, will we ever get any evidence that it was sanctioned by the Russian government? I mean, lots of the callers, Charles, into this show over the last few days and other shows on LBC, a lot of them say the Russians would have been mad to do this.
That's right, but also, if it was the Russians, obviously we've got to prove it was them. But how long is this going to take? Is it going to take weeks, months, years? When will the intelligence come out and definitely say to us? Definitely.
Well, here's the other.
From the lab in Russia,
Charles, Charles, here's the problem. We may never know the absolute truth.
But they were, correct me if I'm wrong here, it's been on the news that they will be able to identify which lab this come from and where it come from. So if they can do that, we know exactly where it come from.
Well, let's hope they can, Charles. And if they identify it to a lab in Russia, that'll get us a lot closer. But we still may well get denials from the Russian government. Charles, I think it must have been the Russians in some way, because otherwise it's just too big a string of coincidences that we've seen over the last few years. I thank you, Charles. Back to Hassan and a better phone line, I hope.
Yes, we had a few rehearsals with the producer.
That's a lot better. Right, the floor is yours. You're back on LBC a year on. Hassan, tell us what you think.
Thank you, Nigel. Yes, so you asked the question, what should Theresa May do? And I think it should be business as usual. The suspicion is towards Russia, obviously, and if there is actually growing evidence, with some probability it was Russia, then of course there should be stronger action here. Now, the main enemies today are Muslim terrorism and far-right extremism. So what this issue has highlighted, we can't still ignore that there is a residual element of the Cold War at play here. Now, there were some criticisms when Amber Rudd actually sent some military personnel, 160 of them, in Salisbury. Yeah. I think she did the right thing because it's a show of force, of strength from a PR perspective to Russia, if they did do it. And you may remember the death of Gareth Williams. He was an MI6 agent. And he was found murdered in Pimlico in a suitcase.
Very strange.
And he was investigating money laundering in Moscow. So, with these examples in mind and Litvinenko, I think what it highlights is some weakness within our insecurity, and that we should really be questioning that and strengthening that, because whilst MI5, MI6 are doing sterling jobs trying to combat terrorism, obviously they can't predict every single act of terrorism. But in the case of Litvinenko, Gareth Williams, and Skripal, they are sitting targets, so the security should have been tightened even more.
Yeah, well, but there's a limit, is there not, Hassan? I mean, you can't provide everyone with security, can you? And somebody who came to this country 6-7 years ago as part of a spy swap, if you said to the taxpayer that he and his family were going to be given 24/7 security, a lot of people would be very upset with that, wouldn't they?
They would, but given the the examples of these three deaths, they were actually sitting targets. So whilst we're not saying 24/7, at least review the security and see what different could be done.
Okay.
If not 24/7.
Okay, Hassan, thank you. And I get from Andrew. Some say you are friendly with President Putin. Perhaps Prime Minister May should dispatch you to Moscow to talk to him about Salisbury. Can I say, for the 100th time on this show, I've never been to Russia. I've never met President Putin. I haven't run memory sticks between him and Trump and Julian Assange. It's just not true, which is a pity, because it would be a great story. You're listening to the Sunday edition of the Nigel Farage Show, exclusive in LBC. It is now 11:30. Well, events in Salisbury today with up to 500 pubgoers and diners being told to wash their possessions as a precaution after agent traces are found, says far from being an attempted contract killing, this is now turning into an act of terrorism. Difficult to see it any other way. Some would say that if it turns out to be the Russians killing one of their own in our country, it's not that far away from being an act of war. Either way, this is now becoming a very, very serious situation. And I think we picked up earlier from the Sky reporter down in Salisbury, from Adele, I think actually, I'm not surprised that people in Salisbury are becoming more, not less concerned with this story as every day goes by. But before I come back to that, just a little bit of Brexit, if you'll allow me. I've been really good. Hour and 36 minutes. It's been a Brexit-free zone. I must throw something in. Interesting piece of polling in the Sunday Telegraph. Poll conducted, commissioned by them, asking a very simple question. Do you agree that the European Union is trying to bully the UK in the Brexit negotiations? 67% agree, only 17% disagree, with the rest undecided. So, a really, really big majority of people who feel that actually Juncker and Barnier and that awful Verhofstadt are just trying to bully Britain. And I think whether it's on the Brexit issue or whether it's on actually this issue confronting Putin, we need the British Prime Minister to be a bit more like Trump and to stand up and say, right, let's have face-to-face meetings. And I'm going to be in the Parliament in Strasbourg on Tuesday morning, where there's a big debate, and it's going to be about the big European summit taking place, where they'll talk about the transition period, the trade deal, etc. But there'll also be a lot of President Trump talks on Tuesday morning as well. And I promise you, I will not shy away from confronting the bullies of Brussels. Absolutely not. So, is it time for Mrs May to show a bit more leadership over this? Maybe even to hand the money back that the Tory party has taken from Russian sources? And some suggesting maybe we shouldn't send the football team to the World Cup, but that doesn't get, I feel, very much support at all. I'm going to go to Mike in York. Mike, good morning.
Good morning, Nigel, and happy Mother's Day to everybody listening.
Absolutely, yeah. So, Mike, tell me what What do you think I mean, we haven't got any proof, but we do have a lot of history, don't we?
We do. But let's remind everybody what we pay an enormous amount of money for, NATO.
Yes.
All for one and one for all. So now's the time to prove it, you know? Instead of May going to see Putin, NATO delegates go to see Putin.
Wouldn't that be a somewhat premature act if we had absolutely no proof that it was a Russian actor that did it? And when I said a few minutes ago it's almost tantamount to an act of war, I didn't say it was quite an act of war in itself, did I?
No, but at the same time, if Russia hadn't done it, someone's got hold of this lethal stuff. We're lucky that only, say, 500 people in Salisbury. What happens if they had a plane and they spread it over the country?
Listen, I completely understand what you're saying, which is why, well, I mean, do you think the Russian government sanctioned this? Is that your feeling?
I don't know, but I think we should adopt the policy of reason to urge, i.e. extreme caution. And the way to get the Russians on side is simply say, this is a very serious matter. If you're not involved, we want your help. The World Cup's coming up. So all our NATO countries, none of them play football in Russia. They all reschedule them elsewhere. They've got fantastic stadiums, so we don't need to bother about that.
Well, I tell you what, Mike, I know a country that's got some really great stadiums all over it, where they had a bid to get the World Cup, which was led by Prince William and David Beckham, and we haven't had the World Cup for over 50 years. We could do it, couldn't we?
We could. I mean, and I think the other thing is, until we know for definite, then what action can we take? But our troops are already in Estonia and wherever, helping other NATO countries.
Yes. Mike, I really worry that you're ramping this up. I mean, I'm suggesting that the Prime Minister, goes to see Putin and says, look, there are major problems here. We got to talk about this. You would really be ratcheting this up almost as far as you could go, wouldn't you?
Well, we're just taking a leaf out of Donald Trump's book. I mean, what does Putin understand? Strength, nothing else.
All right. No, well, it's a compelling argument, but I don't think we've quite yet reached the NATO stage. Mike from York, I thank you. Well, in a way he's right, isn't he? Trump gets tough with North Korea and talks are happening, but I think bringing NATO in at this moment would be too early. On Twitter I get, hard to prove Russia killed, well, he's not dead yet, but killed the double agent. Russian leaders run a rogue-style nation, and this is the problem. It's very, very hard to prove. I also get on Twitter, utter rubbish, of course. It's the Russians and not anyone else. It's referring to those that have been saying maybe it wasn't Russia. I mean, who else has access to a nerve agent? It's not as though anyone can just walk into a supermarket, for instance, and buy it off the shelf, says Dougie in Lewisham. Good morning, Nigel, I get by text. This weapon in Salisbury stands alongside a dirty bomb. It's now time for Theresa May to ask a few questions. No dilly-dallying. The arrogant little man Putin needs to be brought to book, says Frank in Whitehaven. Well, there's some really tough talk in this hour, I have to say, including, sending NATO. Mike, he wants to send NATO off to meet Putin. I think it's a bit early for that. Oh, one of the joys of doing this show is I feel so moderate, but... Let's go to John in Hendon. John, good morning.
Hi. Well, funny enough, I was going to say the same thing about NATO.
Go on.
We've also got, we've got Litvinenko, who you obviously know because his widow was associated with UKIP.
She was, that's right, yes.
Yeah. We're more or less 100% certain of that, and so NATO could get involved on that side of it.
But NATO, John, is about NATO is about a country being militarily attacked. And whilst I do accept, John, there is an escalation of this morning with 500 very worried people in Salisbury. It's not quite the same as an act of war, is it?
It is, because NATO have said that they get involved in terrorism, and they stood up when we got bombed in Manchester and made a bit of noise about that. Also, NATO want to show their relevance after Donald Trump told them that they were totally irrelevant, so they may well be interested. The other thing I wanted to say to you, people keep ringing up saying, well, how do we know it's Russia?
Yep.
Sherlock Holmes, through Arthur Conan Doyle, who was way ahead of his time in police forensics and so on. In fact, the police used him as a sort of textbook.
Yes.
He said, and I quote, "Once you eliminate the impossible, whatever remains, no matter how improbable, must be the truth." And if you think about that, there's only about 3 countries that could be doing this. And once you eliminate them, the only one that's left is Russia.
And who are the 3, John?
Well, ourselves,
Yeah.
America,
Yeah.
Russia, and possibly, I think, France.
Okay.
I think this is what I've heard on LBC. I don't know for sure.
Must be true then, mustn't it?
Yeah,
No,
must be.
okay.
There's only very few countries, and
Yeah.
you have to think, well, what? And then people say, well, they could have killed him while he was in prison, which is true. But on the other hand, they've used him to get one of their own agents back.
Absolutely.
So therefore, he was worth keeping alive for that. And now we don't know what reasons. There may be something going on in recent times that make him a target. But he obviously has been targeted. There's no question about that.
No, of course. Of course he's been targeted. And of that there's no doubt. And John, you're clearly an Arthur Conan Doyle and Sherlock Holmes fan, are you?
And a UKIP fan.
And a UKIP fan. And which actor, in your view, has played the best Sherlock? Is it the old black and white ones of Basil Rathbone, or do we come right up to date with Benedict?
Probably Basil Rathbone, yeah. I don't like the modern versions where they, Benedict Cumberbatch.
Yeah.
I don't like that at all. But
either way, whether it's Benedict Cumberbatch or whether it's Basil Rathbone, your quote was a rather useful and rather brilliant one, and I thank you for it. You're listening to the Sunday edition of the Nigel Farage Show, exclusively on LBC. It's 11:45. Well, we don't know whether it's the Russians that planted this nerve agent in Salisbury. We don't even know whether it was planted in ZZ's or whether it was in the Mill pub or whether it was a parcel that went to the Skripals home. There's an awful lot we don't know. We do know that today, up to 500 pub and restaurant goers from Salisbury have been told to wash all of their possessions as a precaution after traces of nerve agent have been found in both of those locations. And all of this in sleepy Salisbury, or Smallsbury, as it's jokingly referred to. So what's to be done? Should the Prime Minister take a bit of decisive action and demand a meeting with Putin and try and thrash this out? Well, I've been somewhat outflanked in the last 15 minutes by people saying that NATO should get involved. And there was a very interesting point on that NATO is looking for a new role, and countering terrorism is one of them. But I do think the thought of sending off NATO officials to Moscow would be a little premature at this stage, unless I'm just going, I don't know, soft perhaps, in my old age. So I'm just not sure. But I do think it's very difficult for the government to know exactly what to do. We may never get proof of who actually did this. So it's not easy. But I do think the idea that a Prime Minister stands up and says, right, let's have a meeting with the Russians. There's too many coincidences here. There's been too much of this going on the streets of London and now in Wiltshire too. Vicky is calling from Brighton. Good morning, Vicky.
Hello, good morning, Nigel. The point I'd like to make is very simple, I think, that if it's much quicker to identify the laboratory that this stuff was made in, I mean, this is what we're led to believe.
Yes.
And it was identified as a Russian laboratory. And if you turn it round the other way, what would Russia do if this had happened to them in their country and a British laboratory had been identified? The court.
Well, they would be going to they'd probably be going to the UN Security Council and raising merry hell, I'd have thought, Vicky.
Well, of course. And the first thing they'd do is shoot out the British ambassador, close down the embassy and whatever. So, I think the laboratory is the absolute key to this, as to where this laboratory is. And I say, if the authorities are correct, and this can be identified as to which country it came from, because frankly, it's a bit like Porton Down. There's no way that the government and, MI5 and all the rest of it are not totally controlling, as they should do, Porton Down in this country.
Yeah, well, it's a coincidence, Vicky, or is it, that Porton Down, which is the sort of HQ in this country of all the nuclear, biological and chemical testing of agents and things, happens to be, about 3 to 4 miles from the centre of Salisbury?
Well, yes. I don't know. Could something have been stolen or whatever?
Well, I don't know, but I just sort of, pose it. Where else could this stuff come from?
Well, it's got to come from a laboratory somewhere in the world that it has the capability of making it. I mean, that's the bottom line.
Yeah.
So one really doesn't know.
If Vicky, go on,
Yeah.
please do.
Well, it is slightly changing the subject, but maybe it's not meant to be light or frivolous. It's genuine. One comment about Donald Trump. I had open mind about Donald Trump. I'd make my own opinion, but I also like to listen to people who actually know him.
Uh-huh.
And the two people that I watch and listen to regularly are yourself and Piers Morgan. And actually, I like both of you. So if you think he's all right, then that impresses me.
Very good, Vicky. Thank you very much indeed. And thank you for your call. And, of course, Piers and I, who do come from different sides of the political spectrum. David is calling from Virginia Water. David, did the Russians do it?
There's no proof. Firstly, I'm such a great fan of yours, Nigel, you wouldn't believe it.
Right.
There's no proof whatsoever that the Russians were involved.
There is no proof.
A hell of a lot of countries would love this to be blamed on the Russians. But one more point I must make. It's the North Korean leader now wants to meet Donald Trump.
Yep.
And I'll tell you why. It's because the two previous presidents, Bush and Obama, they've done nothing about all these build-up of missiles. But this North Korean leader...
No, David. That was the last hour. I get the point you're making. You're making. Now, let's have a little think about this, right? Who would want to frame the Russians in this way? In whose interest would it be to do this?
I'm pretty sure every country in the world goes round and kills these traitors. At the end of the day, this man who hasn't died yet, I hope he doesn't, and his daughter, they was traitors. And I'm pretty sure it happens all over the world. And Russia's not that stupid. I don't think that. And Russia's a very, very powerful country. And all this about banning football, you don't think Russia worries about that, do you?
Oh, yeah, no, I think the World Cup is a big deal for Russia. I genuinely do. So, it's a huge event that is taking place in their country. I think in terms of prestige. I think in terms of Putin's place in the world. No, David, I think the World Cup's a big deal.
But what I'm trying to explain... There's no proof. It's all assumption, isn't it? It's all they're going to do this. They're going to do that.
But do you? Okay, David, I understand that point, and there is no proof. But we do see a pattern, don't we?
Yes, of course we do. But then again, what are we going to do about it? Because you're talking about a very powerful man in a very powerful country. What are we going to do?
David, I suspect the answer to that is not very much, actually. I suspect you're right, David. I thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much for talking to me, Nigel.
No, not one bit.
Much.
Have a great Sunday. Thank you.
Bye.
Rob says on Facebook, was he targeted because he was a Russian spy? Or has he been up to his old tricks? Here's an idea. Be safe and don't be a Russian spy. Well, I think we can extend that, Rob, into don't make an enemy of Vladimir Putin. Otherwise, your chances of coming to a deeply unpleasant end appear to be rather higher than it is for the rest of the population. Let's go to South Woodford and to David. David, hello, good morning.
Morning, Nigel. I don't want to make, what the Russians may have done here by this poisoning is no different from what other intelligence agencies do. The Americans are killing people in other sovereign countries using drones, people they don't like. A few years ago, the Israeli Secret Service used forged British passports to kill someone in the Middle East.
David, it's a rotten line. I'm going to let you go and try and get you back. David was making the point there that, we use drones to kill people in other countries. The Americans have done it. And, of course, the British were very happy for people like Jihadi John to be taken out by drone strikes. But that was happening inside countries that were already warring countries. It wasn't happening in the sleepy market city called Salisbury in Wiltshire. Tony in Epsom is going to be my last caller of the morning, I think. Hello, Tony.
Hello, Tony. Hello, Nigel. Nice to speak to you, Nigel.
Thank you. So you're welcome to the show. And what do you think, Tony?
Well, I think obviously all week the narrative has been just purely Russia is the only ones in the frame. I think we need to add to that narrative with who else it could be, and not just from callers, but from people like yourselves who prepare for these shows. Coming out, in the media, I've not heard any we've not been taught anything on who else it could be and what reasons other intelligence services or shadow governments, what their reasons for doing it might be. So I think that's something that needs to be discussed.
Tony, I've heard lots of people say there's no proof, don't jump to conclusions. I understand that. I've heard lots of people say, but this could well be someone trying to frame the Russians because the Russians wouldn't be this stupid. But nobody, Tony, has given me any really valid argument as to in whose interests would it really be to do this.
I think, do you know what I find coincidental also, is that this sort of happened in the same week that Donald Trump has announced he's going to see the North Korean leader. So that kind of, it looks like that's dying down, and then this kind of flares up. So it's like reading between the lines. Obviously, Donald Trump didn't announce to the media first that this was happening. This has obviously been planned for quite a while, and then all of a sudden this happens. So I don't really trust everything I see, and I do read between the lines. I think that if you want to say, well, why would someone do it, and why would someone want sort of us to drag us in a war with Russia? Well, Russia's getting in the way in the Middle East, and the seven-nation plan that came out after 9/11, he's interfering with that. So
Could be.
He'll have a lot of enemies with a lot of resources.
but this is a pretty radical thing to do. Tony, I thank you. I want to tell you about my brand new podcast called Farage Against the Machine. I've spent 20 years taking on the establishment, and that's what this podcast is all about. My first episode went out live on Friday, and I take you backstage at the CPAC conference where I interview the chair of the American Conservative Union, Matt Schlapp, about the conference, his relationship with Trump, and maybe CPAC coming to the UK. You've been listening to The Nigel Farage Show. I'm back tomorrow night at 7. At 3 this afternoon, it's Alex Salmond. But up next, it's Majid Nawaz.
Thank you, Nigel.